world was burning. Europe lay in ruins, cities scarred by bomb craters and the echoes of falling steel. Across the Atlantic, the United States was alive with the relentless hum of wartime industry, factories working through the night, trains carrying supplies, and families sacrificing everything for a war half a world away. But behind the clash of armies and the roar of planes, a quieter, more human story was about to unfold. It did not take place on the front lines, but in the guarded stillness of an American prisoner of war camp. Here, thousands of captured German soldiers waited, defeated, disarmed, and uncertain of what the future would bring. And yet, within this unlikely place, fate would bring together two souls who, by all logic, should have remained worlds apart. She was a black nurse, working tirelessly under the shadow of both racial prejudice and the exhaustion of war. He was a young German prisoner, marked by the uniform of an enemy that had once sworn to dominate the world. Their paths should never have crossed. Their gazes should never have lingered. Their hearts should never have dared to defy the boundaries of war, race, and hatred. But love, quiet, fragile, and unyielding, does not ask permission from history. It grows where it should not. It survives where it cannot. And in this story, it bloomed like a hidden flower in the barren soil of conflict. This is the story of an impossible romance. A story buried in whispers, carried in stolen glances, and remembered only in the silence between heartbeats. The prisoner of war camp stood like a silent scar upon the American landscape, its outlines etched in barbed wire and watchtowers, a reminder that even far from Europe's battlefields, the war was never truly absent. The year was 1944, and America was both weary and relentless. In the distance, trains still roared with supplies, newspapers still screamed of battles, and families still prayed for sons who might never return. Yet within these fences, time seemed to move differently. Captured soldiers lived out their days in a strange rhythm, half shadows of the warriors they had once been, men stripped of their uniforms, stripped of their weapons, and left only with their thoughts. They were enemies, yes, but also human beings, suspended in a limbo between defeat and survival. The camp was not what outsiders might have imagined. To the casual eye, there was a paradoxical stillness about it, a sense of strange normalcy. By day, prisoners walked in groups, some working the soil, planting neat rows of vegetables, while others built crude furniture out of spare lumber. In the evenings, one might hear the faint echoes of song, low and mournful, drifting across the rows of barracks as the men tried to remember what home once felt like. The guards were watchful but rarely cruel. Discipline came not through constant violence, but through the quiet threat of rifles perched in towers and the sharp glint of bayonets carried on endless patrols. For her, the black nurse, stepping inside those gates carried its own weight. She had grown used to the contradictions of war, the urgency of life and death decisions in the infirmary, the exhaustion that seeped into her bones after endless shifts, the constant reminder that even as she saved lives, her own country still did not see her as equal. She wore her uniform with dignity, yet she could not forget the stares of those who doubted her skill, the whispers that dismissed her presence as unnatural. But duty was duty, and in that camp duty was a merciless master. Her patients were not only American soldiers, returned from the front with shrapnel in their flesh and fear in their eyes, but also these prisoners, men who had once sworn allegiance to a regime that believed she was beneath them, less than human. And yet here she was, walking the sterile corridors of the infirmary, carrying trays of medicine, preparing gauze, checking pulses. She had long ago learned to steel herself against prejudice, to rise above it with quiet strength, and that strength became her armor each day she entered those wards. Every bandage she tied was an act of defiance, not only against the wounds of war, but against the hatred that had tried to define her. Every fever she soothed, every body she kept alive, was proof that humanity could outlast cruelty. It was in this rhythm, this daily repetition of tasks that dulled the edges of fear, that she first saw him. He was just another German prisoner, lying in one of the narrow cots lined neatly against the walls. His arm was bound in splints, broken in the chaos of battle, and a thin sheen of sweat marked his forehead as he struggled through fever. At first, there was nothing remarkable. He was pale, worn down by pain, no different from the others who had passed through her care. But when his eyes opened, something shifted. They were not the cold, distant eyes of an enemy, nor the hollow gaze of a man defeated. They were alert, questioning, alive with something she could not name. For a fleeting second, as their gazes locked, it felt as if the world outside the infirmary had gone silent. She reminded herself that he was the enemy, that compassion was dangerous. And yet, when his hand trembled as she adjusted his bandage, her instinct was not to pull away, but to steady him. There was no language needed in that moment, no words exchanged, only the quiet recognition of suffering met with compassion. It was the same duty she had sworn to uphold, and yet something about it lingered longer in her thoughts than it should have. Perhaps it was the way he held her gaze without flinching, or the flicker of gratitude that softened the tension in his features. Whatever it was, it unsettled her. The days passed, and she found herself noticing him more than she intended. He did not speak much, but when he did, his voice was softer than she had imagined, carrying a strange mixture of weariness and restrained strength. He thanked her in accented English, words carefully chosen, sometimes halting yet never dismissive. She told herself it was only because he was different from the others, more polite, perhaps, less hardened. But deep down, she knew there was something else tugging at her attention, something unspoken that grew heavier with every visit. Outside the infirmary, the camp remained its own strange world. Guards kept their endless patrols, prisoners lined up for meals, and the air was thick with the unspoken tension of men waiting for a war to decide their fates. But inside those walls, there were moments when the world seemed to pause. She would walk among the cots, the steady rhythm of her footsteps echoing softly, the rustle of her apron carrying through the room. He would watch, not with hostility, but with an intensity that she could feel, even without meeting his gaze directly. And when she did look even briefly, there was always that same question in his eyes. Why? Why would she, of all people, show him kindness? She did not have an answer, not one she could say aloud. She knew only that in a world broken by hatred, the act of saving even one life felt like a rebellion in itself. Perhaps that was why she allowed herself those fleeting glances, why she did not pull away when his hand brushed hers as she passed him water, why she lingered for just a second too long when adjusting his blankets. Perhaps it was foolishness, perhaps only duty, but she knew it was something more, something she could not yet name. The camp was a cage, yes, but inside its walls, fragments of humanity persisted. Men laughed in quiet corners. Friendships formed among those who had once tried to kill each other, and now, without warning, something had begun to take root between a nurse and a prisoner. Neither spoke of it, neither dared to name it, but both felt the shift in the air, the way silence carried more than words. And though it was only the beginning, it was enough to change everything that would follow. Their exchanges began as fragments, small and hesitant, like fragile sparks in the heavy silence of the infirmary. At first, it was no more than the sound of a single word softly spoken. Danke. A simple thank you, whispered in a thick German accent as she handed him water on a sleepless night. She paused, surprised, then nodded without speaking. Gratitude, even from the enemy, was not common. She did not answer him, but the word lingered between them, like a candle lit in darkness. The next day, when she returned with fresh bandages, he tried again. Thank you. His tongue stumbled over the words, as though they were stones he had never carried before. She caught the effort in his tone, and though her reply was only a quiet, "You're welcome," it was the first time she had spoken directly to him. Language was a wall between them, but kindness was a bridge. In the days that followed, their exchanges grew into cautious rhythms. He would attempt short phrases, sometimes halting, sometimes broken, while she responded with patient nods, careful words, and gestures that filled the spaces where grammar failed. When he mispronounced something, she corrected him gently, and he would repeat the words slowly, as if memorizing not only the language, but also the sound of her voice. It was dangerous, this familiarity. She knew the other nurses whispered about fraternization, about the foolishness of wasting words on the enemy. But she also knew that silence could harden into cruelty, and cruelty was a poison she refused to carry. Their conversations, fragile as they were, became moments of escape. He would ask about the medicine, pointing to a vial or a bandage, curious about its name in English. She explained short and precise, using her hands to show meaning when words failed. In return, he would murmur the German word for the same thing, offering her a glimpse into his world, a world she had been taught to see only as monstrous. Sometimes he spoke of home without realizing it, mentioning the forests where he had grown up, the cold winters that bit harder than this American autumn, the songs his mother used to hum. His eyes softened when he spoke of those memories, and though she never asked questions, she listened. She listened not as a nurse, but as a human being. For him, these moments became more than small talk. They were fragments of dignity, fragments of recognition that he was not merely a number in a prisoner's uniform, but a man who could still speak, still remember, still connect. Each word she offered reminded him that he had not been erased completely by war. Each glance of hers seemed to whisper that he was seen not only as an enemy, but as something more. He began to wait for her shifts, to listen for her footsteps along the wooden floors of the infirmary, the faint rhythm that seemed to cut through the monotony of the camp. For her, the bond was more complicated. Every time she lingered near his cot, she felt the weight of invisible eyes. The guards, the nurses, the prisoners who watched everything. She knew that trust was a fragile currency here, and that her compassion might easily be mistaken for betrayal. And yet, she could not help herself. She found herself searching for him, looking into his face when she should have looked past him. There was something in his demeanor, something in the way he never demanded, but always asked, that felt different from the rest. He did not look at her with the disdain she had so often seen in others. He looked at her as though she were a lifeline. The infirmary itself became their world, a world carved out of quiet gestures and unspoken words. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and wood polish. The walls creaked in the evening chill, and lantern light cast long, soft shadows across the cots. Sometimes, when the night was particularly still, she would hear his voice in the darkness, murmuring to himself in German, almost like a prayer. Once as she walked by, he looked up and asked, "Why?" The word was heavy, spoken slowly as if testing its weight. She paused, unsure of what he meant. He gestured weakly to his bandages, his healed arm, his clean sheets. "Why, help." His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. She answered with the only truth she could offer, "Because you're human." Those words seemed to strike him deeply. His lips parted as though he might speak, but no words came. Instead, he looked at her with a softness that unsettled her more than hostility ever could. In his gaze was a mix of disbelief, gratitude, and something she dared not name. From that moment on, there was a change. Their words grew braver, their smiles less guarded. The silences between them were no longer empty, but full of something unspoken, something both of them felt, but could not yet acknowledge. And yet, beneath every word, danger loomed. She knew too well that compassion could be twisted into scandal. She had heard stories of others accused of sympathizing with the enemy, of punishment swift and merciless. Each time she spoke to him, her heart beat faster, not only from fear of being discovered, but from something even more dangerous, the quiet thrill of connection. She told herself it was nothing more than kindness, nothing more than duty. But when she caught herself smiling at the memory of his clumsy English, or when her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted his blanket, she could not deny that something had begun to stir within her. For him, it was clearer. He had lived through the brutality of war, the dehumanization of being captured, the humiliation of defeat. And yet here, in the most unlikely of places, he found dignity not from his captors, but from a woman he had been taught to see as lesser, each moment with her chipped away at the lies he had once believed. He had seen propaganda posters, heard the venom of speeches, lived in a world that thrived on division. But in her presence, all of that dissolved. She was not what his leaders had told him she would be. She was stronger, braver, and more compassionate than anyone he had ever known. There were times when their conversations ended abruptly, interrupted by the shuffle of boots or the sudden bark of orders. In those moments, they shared hurried glances, small nods, acknowledgements that their fragile bond was something they must protect. But in the quiet hours, when the guards grew weary and the lanterns flickered low, they allowed themselves the luxury of words. He would ask her to repeat certain phrases, savoring the sound of her English, while she would laugh softly at his stubborn attempts to master them. Laughter was rare in the camp, but between them it felt natural, unforced. In those fleeting exchanges, they began to build something that defied logic, something fragile yet resilient. She found herself anticipating his questions, waiting for the warmth of his halting words. He found himself listening to her, even when she said nothing, cherishing the simple fact that she existed beside him. Neither dared to call it what it was, not yet. But deep down, both knew that what had started as compassion had already become something more. The war outside the camp never stopped. It roared in newspapers, in the crackling voices of radios, in the telegrams that shattered families. Battles raged across Europe and the Pacific, the thunder of artillery and the screams of men echoing far beyond the reach of this quiet American town. Yet inside the fences, time seemed suspended. The barbed wire sealed them in, but it also cut them off from the chaos beyond. The prisoners lived in a world reduced to routine, roll calls, meals, labor, and endless hours of waiting. For the nurse, though, there was no such stillness. Her days blurred into long shifts, the constant tending of wounds, the endless fight to keep the fragile line between life and death intact. Yet even amid exhaustion, she carried a different weight, one that was harder to name. Every step into the infirmary reminded her of the contradiction she lived. She was saving lives in a country that questioned her own worth. She could serve, she could heal, she could labor until her hands bled, but she could not walk into many rooms in her own hometown without being told she did not belong. Racism followed her like a shadow, unseen but always felt, an unspoken chain around her dignity. She did not let it break her. She had built armor out of resilience, sharpened her spirit with discipline, and carried herself with quiet strength. But when she stood at his bedside, when she met the gaze of the German prisoner she had nursed back from fever, her armor faltered in ways she had never expected. He listened to her differently. That was what she noticed first. When she spoke, he did not dismiss her words or let his eyes wander elsewhere. He watched her with a focus that made her uneasy, not because it was threatening, but because it was too genuine. He listened as if every sound mattered, as if every sentence she offered him was a truth he had never heard before. She was used to being doubted, dismissed, overlooked, but never listened to like this. He, too, felt the weight of contradictions. Back home, he had been taught to believe in superiority, to see the world in rigid hierarchies, to obey without question. But war had shattered those illusions, and captivity had stripped them bare. What remained was the undeniable fact that the woman before him, the woman caring for him, was more human, more dignified, more unyielding than many he had once called comrade. She was the embodiment of everything his leaders had denied. Strength in compassion, power in gentleness, beauty in defiance. Their conversations grew longer, not in length, but in depth. He asked her about her life, about what it meant to serve in a uniform that was not always respected. She did not share much, trust was dangerous, but she let fragments slip through. She spoke of her childhood, of how she had wanted to heal people since she was a girl, even when those around her told her such dreams were wasted. She spoke of her training, of how she had fought to earn her place when doors were slammed in her face. She spoke of the war effort, of how she had poured herself into the work, not for glory, but because human lives were at stake. In return, he offered her glimpses of his truth. He did not speak much of ideology, nor of battles fought. Instead, he shared what lingered when all else had been stripped away, the longing for home, the ache of family left behind, the way war had hollowed out men who once dreamed of simple things. He admitted to her in halting English that he no longer knew what he believed. War had taken his certainties, captivity had taken his freedom, and yet here she was, giving him something he could not define, a reason to feel alive again. Their bond deepened not through grand gestures, but through small, stolen moments. A smile shared across the room when others weren't looking. A word spoken softly, more like a secret than a sentence. The quiet rhythm of her hand as it adjusted his pillow, lingering just a second longer than necessary. None of it was enough to call love outright, not yet, but it was enough to set their hearts beating faster, enough to remind them both that something forbidden was unfolding. She knew the risks. Every day she told herself that what she felt was impossible, foolish, dangerous. She told herself that he was the enemy, that compassion should not become intimacy, that to blur the line between duty and desire was to court disaster. And yet the heart does not obey logic. When she saw him smile for the first time, a faint, fragile smile, the kind that looked as though it had been buried under years of war, her own lips curved in return before she could stop them. It was the kind of smile that asked no questions, made no demands, but promised everything unspoken. At night, she lay awake, replaying those moments, hating herself for her weakness, and yet secretly cherishing it. She thought of his voice, low and careful, struggling with English, but never failing to try. She thought of his eyes, steady and searching, filled with something she could not bring herself to name. In the silence of her small quarters, she told herself it could not be love. But she knew that whatever it was, it had already taken root. For him, the feeling was equally consuming. He had lost everything: uniform, freedom, certainty. And yet, in her presence, he felt a strange sense of rebirth. He watched the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, the way she treated every patient with equal care, whether friend or foe. She had been born into a world that had denied her, and yet she rose above it with a strength that humbled him. Each time she entered the infirmary, he felt his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from a dangerous hope. He did not dare to call it love, but he knew it was something far greater than gratitude. Still, danger lurked in every glance. The guards patrolled with sharp eyes, and the other nurses whispered behind their hands. The walls of the infirmary seemed to have ears, and every moment of silence carried the risk of being shattered by suspicion. They lived in a fragile balance, a dance of hearts held just out of reach, bound by the knowledge that discovery could destroy them both. But in that very fragility, their connection grew stronger. They spoke less in words and more in presence, in the simple act of existing beside each other, of sharing space in a world designed to keep them apart. And so, their hearts collided in the silence. It was not in grand declarations, not in stolen kisses, not in anything that could be named aloud. It was in the weight of their gazes, in the brush of hands, in the moments of stillness where the rest of the world seemed to vanish. They lived for those fragments, those slivers of humanity amid the machinery of war. It was a love that had no place, no permission, and yet it bloomed all the same, fragile and defiant, a secret that belonged only to them. Secrets in a prison camp could never stay safe for long. The world inside those fences was small, far smaller than the prisoners or guards wanted to admit. Every step, every whispered word, every pause of silence could be noticed. And in a place where monotony ruled, even the smallest shift became fuel for rumor. That was how it began. The faintest murmurs, spoken quietly at first, then repeated with growing boldness. A nurse who lingered too long by one cot. A prisoner whose wounds seemed to heal faster under her hand than under anyone else's. Glances exchanged in silence. Moments of stillness that carried weight. At first, she dismissed it. She had learned long ago to live with the sting of whispers, with the feeling of being watched, of being doubted. But here it was different. These whispers carried danger not only for her reputation, but for her safety. In the eyes of the camp, compassion could too easily be mistaken for betrayal. A nurse offering kindness to a German prisoner was already unusual. A black nurse doing so was something some would never forgive. She could feel the judgment pressing on her like a weight she could not shake, and yet she could not pull back. Every time she told herself to stay distant, her heart betrayed her. When she heard his halting voice, struggling to form words in English just for her, she could not help but listen. When she saw the faint smile that appeared only when she entered the room, she could not help but return it. She knew each moment was a risk, but the risk itself seemed to bind them closer together. It was a fragile rebellion, lived in glances and half-formed sentences, but it was rebellion nonetheless. The German prisoner knew it too. He was not blind to the way eyes followed them, the way the air shifted when she stood too long at his side. He sensed the watchfulness of guards, the suspicion of fellow prisoners, the unspoken questions of the other nurses, and yet he did not retreat. He had nothing else left to lose. His freedom was already gone, his country crumbling, his future uncertain. But what he had found in her was something that defied despair. He clung to it quietly, not with words or gestures that could betray them, but with a steadfastness that refused to fade even under scrutiny. The danger made their connection sharper, more urgent. Every small exchange carried the weight of something forbidden. Every glance held the intensity of a secret too dangerous to speak. They learned to communicate in fragments so subtle that no one else could see. A pause of her hand as she set down a tray. A shift in his gaze that lingered a second too long. The faintest nod, the softest smile. Moments that to the outside world looked like nothing, but to them meant everything. She often found herself walking the edges of the camp, caught between duty and desire, between fear and longing. At dusk, when the sun dipped low and the barbed wire glowed red in the fading light, she stood in silence, her thoughts tangled in questions she could not answer. Why had fate placed him here in her care, when it would have been simpler for them never to meet? Why did her heart insist on racing at the sound of his voice, when it should have remained calm, professional, unshaken? Why did danger make it all feel so unbearably alive? The guards patrolled endlessly, their boots striking sharp against gravel, rifles slung across their shoulders. Their presence was constant, a reminder of the line she was never meant to cross. But the human heart does not obey fences or rifles, and so even with danger circling them like wolves, their connection deepened. What was once quiet gratitude had become something heavier, something that lived in her chest and refused to be silenced. She began to fear not only discovery, but the possibility of being forced to sever what had become a lifeline. Rumors grew stronger. Other nurses began to exchange knowing looks. Prisoners whispered among themselves. The camp was alive with suspicions it could not prove. She could feel the eyes on her back, the silence that stretched too long whenever she entered a room. It would have been safer to walk away, to stop lingering at his side, to silence her compassion. But she could not. And in that defiance, however quiet, there was danger but also truth. For him, the risk was equally real. If discovered, he could face punishment, his fragile dignity crushed under the weight of suspicion. But he too did not retreat. Instead, he let the danger sharpen his devotion, even if it had to remain unspoken. In the silence of the infirmary, he watched her, memorized her movements, clung to every word she spoke. To him, she was proof that the world still held light, even in captivity, and so they lived on the edge of exposure. Every day was a balancing act, hiding in plain sight, carving moments of connection out of a world built to keep them apart. They did not need to speak of the danger. It was always there, a third presence between them, shaping every word, every glance, every touch. And yet, the danger itself seemed to weave them together. The risk was part of the bond, the fire that made it burn brighter, even in shadows. There were nights when she lay awake, her heart pounding at the thought of discovery. She imagined being summoned by superiors, stripped of her uniform, cast out not only from her work, but from any measure of safety. She imagined the judgment in their eyes, the cruelty in their voices, the way they would twist her compassion into betrayal. Fear clawed at her, but so did longing. She could no longer imagine returning to a world where he was absent. The prisoner, too, lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his barrack, listening to the restless breathing of men around him. He thought of what it would mean if their secret was exposed, of how swiftly the guards could turn from indifferent to merciless. Yet even with that knowledge, he did not wish to let go. He whispered her name in the darkness, not aloud, but inside his mind, as though the act of thinking it gave him strength. And so, their secret lived on, fragile but unbroken. The camp was filled with walls, fences, and watchful eyes, but none of it was enough to kill what had already taken root between them. They carried their bond like a hidden flame, small but unyielding, ready to burn even in the harshest winds. It was dangerous, yes. It was reckless. But it was real, and in a world torn apart by hatred, that reality was worth every risk. The war outside the fences raged on, but inside the camp, time moved differently. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Seasons shifted. The bitter winds of winter gave way to the slow thaw of spring, and the earth softened, grass pushing through the hard soil, as if to remind everyone that life, no matter how trampled, always found a way forward. For the nurse and the prisoner, each passing season was marked not by calendars or military orders, but by the fragile evolution of their bond. What began as silent gratitude had grown into something undeniable, something neither of them could pretend away any longer. The weight of secrecy had not diminished. It had only deepened, shaping their every move. But alongside the danger, there came a quiet inevitability. They could not live forever on stolen glances and half-hidden smiles. Human hearts are not made for silence alone. And so, without planning it, without ever daring to name it, their connection began to take on new forms. Small words slipped between them when no one else was near. Sentences carried more than their literal meaning, layered with feeling that both of them understood but never acknowledged aloud. He began learning more English, struggling through the clumsy rhythm of unfamiliar words, determined to close the gap between them. At first, his sentences were broken, stilted, but his effort alone spoke volumes. She, in turn, found herself listening not only to his words, but to the silences between them, the pauses where emotion gathered, where something deeper wanted to surface but could not yet break free. Moments multiplied, a touch that lingered longer than it should have, a word that carried more warmth than protocol demanded. She began to dread the moments when duty pulled her away from his side, when she had to leave him behind in a room filled with strangers who did not and could not see him as she did. In those moments, she felt the ache of distance, as though something vital had been torn away. The prisoner, too, lived for her presence. In the endless monotony of camp life, she was the single point of color, the light that cut through the gray. The sound of her footsteps approaching was enough to quicken his breath. The warmth of her hand brushing against his as she passed him water was enough to sustain him through nights of doubt. He found himself clinging not to the idea of freedom, something that seemed impossibly far, but to the hope of seeing her again, of stealing one more moment in her company. But the danger never left them. It circled always, a shadow behind every word. They grew careful, more careful than ever, knowing that what they carried between them could not be hidden forever if they grew careless. They learned to mask their feelings behind the routine of care, to cloak intimacy in professionalism, to disguise affection as duty. Yet even with all their caution, the truth was written in the air between them, a current too strong to ignore. She often asked herself what future there could be, if any. She knew the world beyond the fences was not kind, that even if the war ended tomorrow, the barriers between them would not vanish. She lived in a country that judged her for the color of her skin, that denied her opportunities others took for granted. He came from a land that was at war with her own, a nation whose soldiers had inflicted horrors she could not forget. And yet, when she looked at him, none of that mattered. The world reduced itself to the simple, unshakable truth that he was not like the others, and she was not simply his nurse. Their love grew not in grand declarations, but in quiet resilience, in the way she shielded him with her presence when guards grew too harsh, in the way he softened his voice whenever he spoke to her, as though afraid of breaking the fragile bond between them, in the way they both found strength in silence, because silence was safer than words, but no less powerful. Still, silence could not contain forever what had already become too large to be hidden. One evening, as dusk settled over the camp, painting the sky in muted shades of gold and grey, she lingered by his cot longer than she should have. The ward was quieter than usual. Most of the prisoners slept, their breaths heavy with exhaustion. He turned his head toward her, his eyes catching the last trace of sunlight. In that moment, something shifted. Words rose unbidden, trembling on the edge of silence. And though they both knew the risk, neither could stop what came next. His voice was quiet, broken but deliberate. "You are hope." The words were simple, imperfect, heavy with an accent that made them sound almost fragile. But to her, they carried the weight of something immeasurable. For a long moment she could not answer. Her throat tightened, her heart thundered. And then, before caution could silence her, she whispered back, not a declaration, not something foolish enough to be overheard, but something small, something that still carried everything she felt. "You matter." The exchange was over in seconds. She turned, moved away, her face set in practiced neutrality. But inside her soul was alight with fire. It was the first time either of them had dared to cross the line from silence into words, the first time the truth had been spoken, however obliquely. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. And from that night forward, everything between them was changed. The days that followed felt heavier with tension, but also richer with meaning. Their conversations, still brief, still careful, carried new undertones. Their silences spoke louder than ever. They did not need to say more. The simple knowledge that they had crossed the threshold was enough. The bond was no longer a fragile suspicion. It was real, and it lived in both of them. But with reality came the sharp edge of consequence. Rumors had not vanished. Guards still watched. The war outside still raged, and with each passing day the future grew more uncertain. They knew that what they had found could not remain hidden forever, and yet neither of them could bring themselves to stop. They were caught in a current they could no longer resist, carried forward by forces larger than themselves. There were nights when she lay awake, asking herself if she was foolish, if she was reckless, if she was gambling everything on something that could never last. But then she remembered his eyes, the way they softened when they met hers, the way his voice had trembled when he called her hope. And she knew that, reckless or not, it was real. And reality, once found, cannot be abandoned. For him, the fear of punishment was constant. But stronger than fear was the knowledge that in a world that had stripped him of his freedom, his dignity, his identity, he had found someone who saw him not as an enemy, not as a number, but as a man. That truth was worth the risk. That truth was everything, and so they carried on, quietly, carefully, but with hearts no longer in denial. Their love was a hidden rebellion, a defiance of the fences, the guards, the hatred that surrounded them. It was fragile, but it was also unbreakable, for it lived not in the world outside, but in the space between two souls who had found each other against every odd.